By the time I got to the 10th or 11th grade, there may have been 2 sentences about the civil rights movement in our history books. As significant a movement as that was in the South, there was a group of, and this came out of Texas. There was the daughters of the American Revolution literally led an effort to control the history books in public education, particularly in the South. And they actually controlled school boards. They started by getting by getting a lot of their members on the school boards with the mission of making sure that only books that were approved by the Daughters of American Revolution were used in certain schools. So they would vote or fight for certain publishers who had aligned their history to the conservative view of history.
Welcome to Peter and Phil's Courageous Conversations, a podcast addressing race relations and social issues in hopes that you'll be inspired to do the same. Now, let's begin our conversation with your hosts, Dr. Peter Weinstein and Dr. Phillip Nelson.
Welcome to Peter and Phil's Courageous Conversation. I'm Dr. Peter Weinstein. These conversations started in the summer of 2020, shortly after the murder of George Floyd, and we've continued to have conversations on a regular basis about issues impacting race in the United States. This episode is entitled, Versions of History. Enjoy and share.
Did you see, and I think it was on Rachel's show, it may have been on CNN or someplace else, that they finally dug up and removed the last lynching pole in Georgia?
No.
So they had some video of that. And Sharon, who was sitting next to me when we were watching it, said, "You mean those things are still out there?" I said, "Yeah, and that shouldn't surprise you."
Tell Sharon that they didn't always have lynching. They didn't have to use lynching poles.
No, they had trees.
Every Southern community tended to have a lynching tree.
Yeah.
And those trees are still living.
Yep.
And in some communities, there are some people who still know those trees as lynching trees.
Yep.
And that is the sad part, because some people keep those lynching trees alive by sharing the history with their children. But imagine how they share that history depending on which culture they represented. So in the Deep South, some people will promote the lynching tree as a time when things were better. And others will share the history of that tree as we can never go back. And that latter probably happens in both cultures, but the former happens in order to promote heritage. They say heritage, not hate, but that's heritage. And for a young child, they see it from a romantic perspective. And it may not start with hate, but they accept a hateful symbol as a representative of a better time. And because we accept punishment for crimes, it's a lot easier to get down that road that was just a form of punishment and people were lynched for crimes. And we may not believe in the death penalty anymore, but those lynchings were probably deserved.
There's a whole litany of reasons that people were chosen first to go to the gas chambers or that were lynched. Many of them would be in the current day and age considered trite. In the concentration camps, it might have been stealing a piece of bread in the kitchen. During the slavery times, it might have been talking back to a master from that standpoint. What's your take on the statues and taking down of the statues and things of that nature?
I have mixed feeling about that. I don't hate the statues. So let me start by saying, what do you want to do with the Jefferson Memorial?
Well, you can say the same thing about the Washington Monument.
Exactly. Exactly, right? So are we going to tear that down? They were placed there because of their role in starting this country. That's why the monument is there. That's why the memorial is there. And of course, at the time, slave ownership was not a big issue. Now that it is, it doesn't diminish what they did in establishing this country.
Right.
Many of the Confederate statues that we want removed, or that a lot of people want removed, were placed there because the Confederacy had not given up yet. They may have lost the war, but there was still some hope that the Confederacy might continue. And in essence, it did. We were a split nation even under one flag.
Can't you argue that we're still a split nation?
I sure can, but I think we're less split geographically and more split politically.
Yeah.
Right. I say that when even the 12 colonies were pretty split.
Yeah.
I mean, the 12 colonies were just that, 12 colonies, even when we joined. Virginia did not want to have to pay New York's debt.
Right.
But Virginia didn't have any debt because they had free labor.
Yep.
So many of the statues that were raised in the South were raised, or even in the North, were raised by clans. I don't mean that word to be similar to the KKK.
Clan with a C.
Yeah, clans with a C. That was raised by clans of people who were trying to promote their heritage from a nationalistic perspective. There were people right after the Civil War that were still members of the Confederacy as far as they're concerned. They were just a trodden nation. They had been invaded, and especially people in Georgia after, Sherman burned his trail through Georgia. All he did was create more terrorists. Yeah. So this is a much more complicated issue than people think. There are two things that I believe. First of all, I'm 100% for removing a Confederate symbol of a Confederate general that's in the middle of a city square, because that implies that the city has condoned it. And if I'm a citizen of that city, then I have to question whether my city has grown to the point, has evolved to the point that they recognize I am an equal citizen. That statute that is implicitly endorsed by city government or county government makes me wary of the police. It makes me wary of the mayor, even if he or she is Black. It makes me wary of government. Now, I don't want to forget my history, though. I need a place to be able to teach my children where we've come from. So I don't want to destroy the statue. Let's have a museum.
Bingo. Where is the Museum of the Confederacy? Where is the Museum of Slavery? I mean, we need to have some place to go to remember. We can't stop remembering.
There's a Holocaust museum.
Exactly. There's a multitude of Holocaust museums, and the largest portion in the Museum of Germany is World War II and a focus on the wrongs that were done during World War II.
Yes. So where you put them depends on the local history.
Yeah.
But it should not reflect government. I'm not saying the government can't support it or pay for the museum or whatever, but it should be in support of accurate history reflection. And if we can't own our mistakes, then we will repeat them.
What's also interesting is the number of TV shows and documentaries that have been released since March that have a focus on all of these types of issues. HBO's got this series called Lovecraft Country, which is focused in the 60s, I believe, and racism in the Midwest, even that shows, and even in New England, curfew cities and curfew counties, and
See, I like the way you say even in New England.
Yeah,
People still think of New England as a racial haven.
Yes, it was interesting because the stories of moving north, and we talked about this at one of the podcasts or one of the conversations as well, as moving north as a safe haven from that standpoint. And all it did was just relocate. Anyhow, it's just been interesting to watch. On one of the TV shows, and it may have been on Samantha Bee, it may have been John Oliver, I don't recall. They were interviewing people who are in complete denial of the Civil War being fought, and this is because of the statues, as a segue to the statues discussion, is that the reason for the Civil War was not slavery, but was states' rights.
Yeah, I can't believe they're still trying that. I was indoctrinated with that as a child myself. That was the Southern strategy. You remember the book I told you to read? I asked you to read, Making Hay Slowly?
Yes.
That was part of the Southern strategy. The other Southern strategy was to rewrite history or eliminate historical issues. So as the Civil Rights Movement was making history, Martin Luther King died in 1967. I was in the 7th grade in 1967. By the time I got to the 10th or 11th grade, there may have been 2 sentences about the Civil Rights Movement in our history books. As significant a movement as that was in the South, there was a group of, and this came out of Texas. There was the daughters of the American Revolution literally led an effort to control the history books in public education, particularly in the South. And they actually controlled school boards. They started by getting by getting a lot of their members on the school boards with the mission of making sure that only books that were approved by the Daughters of American Revolution were used in certain schools. So they would vote or fight for certain publishers who had aligned their history to the conservative view of history. And that's why nobody learned about Juneteenth. That's why nobody knows about, that's why Martin Luther King, it was never a big hero for a long time. As a matter of fact, some of the history books talked more about his FBI record and tried to make him a criminal rather than a civil rights leader.
It's the same efforts that they've made with the Holocaust that,
Yes.
If you can redirect, it's the efforts of the magicians of the world to distract you from what's real by having the ability to make the pyramids disappear.
Yes.
So.
Thank you for joining us for another courageous conversation. Be sure to follow us and check back next week for more.